Good morning, Sunny Hills Church of Christ and all of our friends joining us for these Friday morning devotionals. I'm Randy Elliott, and I will be finishing up my series on the Sermon on the Mount today. So if you've been with us, this has been a couple of months looking at different pieces of the Sermon on the Mount and trying to understand Jesus' overall message from beginning to end. And he begins with the Beatitudes, which is the way of approaching the Father that he brought into a world where God's people had been convinced that the way to approach him was more like the Pharisaic thing that was going on, the performance-based righteousness that tended to cause people to become judgmental and condemning and boastful. And so Jesus comes in and he says, here's what relationship with God looks like. Now, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you can't even see the kingdom of heaven. So he's trying to say it's this, it's not that. And we've seen that throughout, this, not that. So today we're in Matthew 7, and we're going to cover 21 through 27. And so let me read that. He says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who's in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and perform many miracles?' And then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.' Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." So this is the conclusion. Now, it's a conclusion of a sermon that points to a relationship with God that's based in humbly approaching God, recognizing we have a poverty of spirit without him. We have no life. And so we mourn about the sin that has separated us and that keeps us from having that relationship with God. And we meekly submit to his will rather than ours. We accept his lordship. And then we hunger and thirst for his righteousness. And we are filled. And then we start to become like him in that he is merciful, we become merciful. And he is pure, and so we become pure. And then he's a peacemaker, so we become peacemakers. And he was persecuted for righteousness' sake, and we will also be persecuted. And that's the nature of the kingdom of heaven. So that's what Jesus was teaching against sort of this other path, this broad path, this other way that people are trying to get near God, and that is by, look, I did all the right things. Look at I kept all the rules. And so, you should be proud of me, God. I get to be here. And that's sort of how it's concluding. That's how the sermon is concluding. Listen, in verse 21, he says, and listen, this passage has been used to threaten people like those who are very legalistic think this verse is talking about others. And when I say that, I know it's true because I was, first few years of my Christianity, I was somebody who would use this verse to point at others and say, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord. And all the time, those three fingers were pointing back at me. He was talking to me, and I didn't know it at the time. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who's in heaven. Right there, we sort of jump ship. We leave the context, and we go throughout the Bible, and we find every possible rule and law and systematic religion we can, and we say, here it is, this big giant thing, and if you can accomplish this, then you'll be okay. But those who call him Lord, Lord, but don't do all this, you're toast. That's nonsense. That is sick nonsense. It's not what he's saying at all. Listen to the problem. He says, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord. That's what we're talking about. Not everyone who comes and says, Lord, Lord, will enter. Why? Well, many are going to come and say, Lord, Lord, and here's the ones he's talking about. These are the ones who are not going to enter. Why? What'd they do wrong? He's going to tell you all the bad stuff they did. It's right here. Many will come to me on that day and say, Lord, Lord, did we not do Now you almost have to wonder what he's going to say next. Because these are the guys who aren't going to enter. He just told you. Some are going to say, Lord, Lord. They're not all going to go in because some are going to come and say this. And this is what they did wrong. What they do wrong. What's he going to list? All kinds of evil sins that we might preach about every Sunday? Well, let's listen. Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? In your name drive out demons? And do many wonderful works? Or perform many miracles? Yeah, that doesn't sound like bad stuff to me. Many will come to me on that day and say, Lord, didn't we do all this awesome stuff? These are good things. Prophesy in your name, that's what the early church did. That's what Jesus' immediate disciples did. They prophesied in his name. And in your name, drive out demons? They were doing that. They were going around driving out demons. In fact, Mark tells us these signs will follow those who believe. They were driving out demons and performed many miracles. Jesus' disciples immediately went and they were performing all kinds of miracles. What's wrong with that stuff? There's nothing wrong with the stuff. There's something wrong here, but it's not the stuff. It's not the stuff that's wrong. Didn't we do all these awesome things? And then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Evildoers? They look like good Christians. They're doing all the stuff. What's wrong here? What's he pointing at that's wrong? It's not in the stuff that's listed. The stuff's all great stuff. But the problem is, many will come before me on that day, the judgment day, and standing before me, they'll say, Lord, didn't we do? That's where the problem lies. If we're standing before him saying, didn't we do? Hey, look at what we did. Yeah, Isaiah says our righteousness is like filthy rags. What we did is not going to get us there. What we did will not repair a relationship with God. It doesn't work that way. Jesus said, if you want to go that way, you better be perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect. And you can't do that way. The only way to be perfect is to approach God like the Beatitude says, in humble meekness, submitting to him as Lord, accepting his righteousness, and becoming like him. This is the pathway to God. Coming before God and saying, but look at what I did. What you did is filthy rags if it's apart from Christ. And so this carries on into the final piece, the sand and the rock where you build your house. And again, people go off the reservation with this. They just, it says, therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. And somehow that seems to be some license to go throughout everywhere again and find all the possible things that could be made a rule and put them on people and say, here you go. This is how you make your foundation solid rock by somehow keeping all these rules. It's not what he's saying. He's saying, if you hear what I'm saying in this sermon, if you hear this sermon, the point of this sermon, if anyone hears these words of mine and puts them into practice, where you're approaching God based on his grace and mercy and forgiveness and his righteousness, where you're approaching God for a relationship, you're not trying to bring your own righteousness to God. Hey, God, look at me, evaluate me. I did it all right. That's sinking sand. Solid rock foundation. On Christ, a solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. Dressed in his righteousness alone. Faultless to stand before the throne. The problem with coming before God and saying, hey, didn't I do? And the reason that is sinking sand is because we'll never do enough. We'll never know enough. We'll never be enough. I've shared this, but when I was in ministry at one church, there were just far too many cases where I would visit somebody who was maybe facing, another bypass surgery, or maybe they were facing a medical diagnosis that meant, a couple of weeks left. whatever it was. But I would visit them at home or in the hospital, and it would be the same story. Randy, I don't know if I know enough. I don't know if I've done enough. I don't know if I'm good enough. And some of these people, fifth generation church people, and been in church all their lives, every time the doors are open. But they were fed a diet of the reason you're right with God is because you're doing it all right. And they laid there without hope because their foundation was sinking sand. If our hope rests on our performance, sinking sand. If our hope rests on the grace of God, in a covenant relationship with Jesus, by faith, solid rock. Because it's not based on how well I can perform. It's based on what Jesus did on the cross. My faith in the love of God that he showed there. And the forgiveness, and the grace, and the mercy, and the promise of the Holy Spirit. My faith rests on him. And when I do that, it's solid rock. So, the basic message here and of the Sermon on the Mount is when we approach God, we approach him humbly, recognizing our need for him, humbly recognizing that it's going to take dying to ourselves if we're going to be able to experience him. And when we stand before him, we won't be saying, hey, look at what I did. We'll be saying, thank you for what you did in me. We are crucified with Christ, and yet we live, but not I, but not we. Christ lives in us. And so the life we now live in the flesh, we live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved us and gave himself for us. Remember that? Well, God bless you this Friday. I hope you enjoyed this series on the Sermon on the Mount. Bye-bye.